New York in the summer is always a great time, and this year I've been able to document some of it on a very interesting camera. This is the Sigma BF, and for the last month I've been putting it through its paces on the streets of New York City, and in this video we're going to talk about it. So at the beginning of July, Sigma loaned me their newest BF camera, as well as two of their contemporary lenses, which are the 35mm f2 and the 90mm f2.8. Just a quick disclaimer though, Sigma did not pay me to make this video or say anything specific about it. I have this gear on loan and I'm sending it back to them next week, and I'm just making this video because I was genuinely interested in the camera. So when this camera initially dropped, it was kind of polarizing. You know, some people were praising Sigma for taking a risk with a camera that's so different, and others were kind of skeptical about that. And the thing that stands out about this camera is truly the design, and that's kind of what I want to focus on in this video, so let's jump into it. The body is very minimal, which is what you notice kind of right off the bat. Each camera is made from a single aluminum block. It has a built-in microphone, which has these two holes at the top, and right next to that is the shutter button. There is no hot or cold shoe, there's no viewfinder, there's no microphone jack, and there's only one strap eyelet for a wrist strap on the right side. Next to the screen, we have the power button, the playback button, and the options button, along with a small electronic display and a small thumb grip. On the left side, you have a USB-C port, which is there for charging, as well as file transfer, because this camera doesn't take SD cards. Instead, it has 230 gigabytes of internal storage, which is really interesting. If we look at the bottom, you'll find a standard tripod screw mount, as well as this little tab that slides over to eject the battery, which is flush with the bottom of the camera. It's also rubberized, which is nice, and it doesn't slide off any surfaces considering what it's made of. For the internals of this camera, you're getting a 24 megapixel full frame sensor that can shoot both DNG and JPEG files, or both at the same time. And then for video, you can shoot up to 6K at 30 frames per second in L-Log. So those are some of the main features, but the real question is, what is it truly like to shoot with? So I'm a longtime Sony shooter. My main camera is the a7 IV that I use for both photo and video, and using the BF, which by the way stands for Beautiful Foolishness if you were wondering, using the BF was pretty simple to use initially. However, I'm not gonna lie, I had to Google how to turn the camera on because the power button isn't very obvious. It's just kind of, you know, one of the buttons on the back that just has a dot on it, so a little confusing. One of the first things I noticed about this camera was the quality of the screen, and you know, if you're not going to have a viewfinder on the camera, then that becomes a lot more important. And this screen has 2.1 million dots, which is the same as the Sony a7R5 and Canon R5, and it actually has more screen resolution than the Leica Q3 and the Fujifilm X-T5, which, you know, all that to say, it is a very good screen. I have experience shooting on a camera that doesn't have a viewfinder, which is my Ricoh. And that screen is rough, and it's also a lot smaller. So considering that the BF has a fixed screen that you're not able to tilt or anything, the resolution and brightness of the screen is, you know, it makes it more pleasant to shoot with on sunnier days. So one thing I will say is that when it comes to using a camera without a viewfinder, I find it a little bit more difficult to shoot on a longer focal length. That's why I've barely been shooting with the 90. I've definitely used like the 35, probably 97% of the time that I've had the BF. But I just think that when it comes to shooting without a viewfinder, and like earlier I was wearing sunglasses, so it was really hard to see the screen as well. But you have to be a little bit more conscious of your composition when you're shooting 90, because like you can't just point and you'll be, you know, locked onto the composition you want. Whereas for 35, you have a lot more leeway. So yeah, that's why I have the 90 with me out today. Just gonna try to take some more photos because I have barely used it in the last month. So this camera only has an electronic shutter, so you're not going to get the haptic feedback when you take a photo as you would with a mechanical shutter. So I remember like the first few photos I took, I didn't realize that I even took them. You can turn on the shutter sound as well as like screen blackout to kind of give you confirmation that you took a photo, but I personally like to keep those off, so it took me a little bit to just kind of get used to that. So this little electronic display above the dial is really nice. If you're someone who likes to have a blank screen without any shooting information on it, you can still look and change your settings through the display. You click the wheel to change the settings, and then you scroll with it to change that specific one. Also, something I've never seen on a camera before, which is kind of cool. It was a little confusing at first, but when the camera is completely off, the buttons have no play, so you're not able to like press them in. They're kind of like locked, except the shutter and power button, of course. But then once you turn the camera on, then you can actually press the buttons in. Another thing is that the playback and option button have a touch sensitivity, so if you just place your thumb over it, it'll show the respective menu. So this camera turns on pretty quickly, which is kind of important in my case because when I'm walking around the streets, I typically have the camera turned off to preserve battery, but if there's a scene unfolding in front of me, the camera can turn on really quickly, and that just reduces the chances of me missing that photo. So on the topic of the battery, I only had one to work with, and it typically wasn't enough for a full day of shooting, and I either had to switch cameras or charge it using my portable charger. When I go out for a typical day of street photography, I'm out for about, an average of 6 hours. And I always make it a habit to turn my cameras off when I'm not using them. And this camera has a sleep mode, which is nice. And you can set that to go into effect after a certain amount of inactivity. But I think for longer days of shooting, I would prefer an extra battery, especially if you're also doing video. I think one of the biggest questions that I had before using the camera was, would it be comfortable to hold and shoot with for a longer period of time? Because this camera only has one eyelet for a wrist strap, you can't really attach a neck strap to it, so you're kind of forced to hold on to it for the whole time. With that said though, in my experience, this is not necessarily a one-handed camera. I always have two hands on the camera when I'm taking photos, because if you have a slightly bigger hand like I do, then it gets a little tough to just kind of operate all the buttons. So there is an indent on the bottom right corner of the camera, which makes it a lot more comfortable to hold, because if it was anything like the other three corners, then it would probably dig into your hand a little bit. I was also mainly shooting on this 35mm f2, which is kind of heavy for its size, and I think I would prefer a slightly more compact lens for this camera. But with that said, this lens is phenomenal and it looks really good on the BF in the silver colorway. Now let's talk about everyone's favorite thing, autofocus. I can't really speak on the autofocus performance at night because I didn't shoot with it at night at all, but I did during the day and it was good. The autofocus performance is obviously dictated a little bit by the lens that you're using, but like I said, this lens is really good and I had no issues with it. To focus, I was using the touch screen to kind of select my subject, and the camera itself also has human and animal tracking, and I had that turned on the entire time. So when it comes to focusing, you have AFS, AFC, and manual, and then you also can choose between single point or area, and I definitely used single point for the majority of my photos. If there was one thing I could add, it would be the ability to change the size of the single point, but that's really it. In terms of the autofocus when it comes to video, I didn't test it too extensively, but from the tests I did, it was pretty good. Like I said, I don't want to kind of dwell on it too much because I use this camera more for stills than I did for video. So a few more things on the photo side. I either shot in single capture or 5 frames, continuously, but if you need more, then you can shoot up to 8. So there are 2 different metering modes, which are spot and multi. And I typically did not use spot, I either used multi or I just manually adjusted the settings. And one thing I was kind of missing on this was a highlight metering mode, because that is typically how I shoot a lot of my work. And that's something I would love to see in a future firmware update, but that's just me. You can also shoot in 7 different aspect ratios, which unfortunately I didn't get the chance to play around with too much, but I mainly just shot in 3x2. There are also 13 color modes that you can choose to shoot in, but personally I don't really use them on any camera, so I just shoot in the standard look. So a little bit more about the video. Like I said, I didn't really test it too extensively, but from what I did shoot, it is a very capable camera on the video side of things as well. So you can shoot up to 6K in 10-bit color with L-Log, but a little caveat to that is that you can't use the electronic image stabilization when you're shooting in 6K. However, though, the video from this camera looks really solid. The autofocus in good light is good, but just from a few tests in my darker room, I noticed that the AF can kind of lag a little bit. I also noticed it wasn't as sticky to a subject that is constantly moving. At the end of the day though, I would describe the BF as a stills camera that has some very good but minimal video specs. Lastly, we obviously have to talk about the images themselves. Now, I'm not much of a pixel peeper, but between these 2 lenses that I used and the camera itself, the images came out great. The Sigma Contemporary line of lenses is super solid, and I actually wish I had them for E-mount for my Sony, but yeah, I had no concerns on the image quality front. I always shoot in RAW, and my DNG files were anywhere between 26 and 45 megabytes in size, and I found them to be really similar to my Sony files when it came to editing. I was able to apply my presets on the photos and they worked seamlessly, and I also underexposed some photos on purpose just to see how much detail the shots retained in the shadows, and it was perfectly flexible. 230 gigabytes of internal storage is plenty, and it's way more than I need, and it's just nice to have because when I have the occasional mini heart attack, thinking that I've forgot my SD card, I'm relieved to know that this camera can't even take one. I wouldn't mind having this camera as part of my kit. Now, it wouldn't replace my A7 IV or act as my primary workhorse camera, but anytime I want to go out and have a very capable camera with me that's not exactly the do-it-all, this would be the perfect option. This camera is also just super sleek. It's unlike anything I've ever used before, and it's definitely a conversation starter, and it just kind of makes me wonder about the future of camera design, so props to Sigma for that. If I could add a few things, I would add an extra eyelet right here on the left side next to the USB-C port, so that way you're able to use a neck strap. I would also add highlight metering as well as the functionality to change the size of your focus area. Aside from that, I don't think there's a need to change anything else because this camera is intentionally minimal, at least on the outside. And on the inside, it's probably better than most people expect. I'm going to be sending all this stuff back to Sigma next week, but it was a pleasure to use. And if you have any questions, just feel free to leave a comment. I'm also going to have a blog that you can find in the description that goes into a little bit more detail about some things that I didn't cover in this video. Anyways, that's it for this video. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.